Edith Stein was one of those people whose whole life seemed to be a sign. She was born on Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, in 1891, Breslau, Germany, in a devout Jewish family. As a child, Edith once wrote that she was convinced she was destined for something great, but she could not have imagined how that notion of atonement, suffering in reparation for sin, would play out in her own life. For nearly 50 years later, on the eve of World War II, Edith would offer herself as a sacrifice of atonement for true peace. Her offering, first as a Christian, then as a Carmelite nun, became a reality at Auschwitz. Edith's instinct to offer her life surely had its roots in the example of her own mother. Edith was not yet 2 years old when her father died suddenly, leaving her mother to raise the 7 living children and manage the family business. When everyone else recommended she sell the lumber yard that her husband had owned, Edith's mother learned the trade, and the business prospered in her hands, enough to later fund Edith's college education. Brought up reading the Psalms and Proverbs, Edith considered her mother a living example of the strong woman of Proverbs 31, who rises early to care for her family and trade in the marketplace. Although she excelled in school, Edith rebelled as a teenager, dropped out of school at age 14, and no longer practiced her Jewish faith. She considered herself an atheist, although she continued to admire her mother's attitude of prayer, dedication, and openness to God. When Edith made the decision to stop praying, she embarked instead on a search for truth. And she was open and honest enough to follow that truth wherever it would lead. For after many years, it would lead her back to God. Also, unlike many modern atheists, Edith never used her loss of faith as an excuse for self-indulgence. She detested the loose morals of the time and guarded her own chastity. After 2 years adrift from school, Edith became galvanized by the academic challenge of passing the entrance exams. Through a tutor and her own study, as she later said, this is one of the happier times in her life because she had the opportunity to use her intellect at full throttle. Given her extraordinary intellect, it is perhaps not surprising that she decided to study the seemingly impractical field of philosophy. Contrary to her mother's wish, who wanted her to study something like medicine or law, philosophy was well suited to Edith's talent for abstract thinking and interest in teaching. And she was further attracted to examine the essence of what makes us an individual person. She was one of the first women to be admitted to the university studies in Germany, moving from the University of Breslau to the University of Gottingen in order to study with Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, a study of how we come to know from the phenomena we experience. During this time, the first seeds of faith were planted, partly as her philosophical studies opened her to the possibility of the transcendent, and primarily as many of her friends were Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, including several converts. Husserl had converted from Judaism to Christianity as a young man. And another one of her professors, Max Scheler, was full of Catholic ideas, she said, and had a subtle effect on Edith, who was encountering a hitherto totally unknown world. Her commitment to the truth caused her to shed all her blinders and prejudices. So in a way, her atheism cleared the deck for her to examine all the options. And she was, as she said, gradually transformed almost without noticing it. By the way, Pope St. John Paul II also studied Husserl's phenomenology and wrote his dissertation on Max Scheler. So he was certainly influenced by the writings of Edith Stein. It says something about her character and generosity that when World War I broke out, Edith put her life and academic career on hold to become a Red Cross nurse, despite her mother's opposition, as she wanted to help the soldiers in the war effort in any way she could. She was called upon to serve at the hospital for soldiers with infectious diseases, where Edith spent 6 months essentially mothering soldiers back to health, spoon feeding patients, changing sheets, bathing the helpless, carefully cleaning wounds. In sum, she was good at her work because she did these small services with love. Returning to school and completing her doctorate in 1916 at the age of 24, Edith would become the assistant to her mentor and teacher, Husserl, for as a woman, she could not get appointed to a professorship at the university level. Women had only recently been allowed to even study at universities. It would be some years before that they could be appointed faculty. As Father now Bishop Barron mentioned, an important moment in Edith's conversion came when a fellow philosophy student was killed in the war. Edith expected to find his wife broken and distraught, but instead she found the grieving widow unshaken. Edith later said, "Then I first encountered the cross and the divine strength it inspires in those who bear it. For the first time, I saw before my eyes the church, born of Christ's redemptive suffering, victorious over the sting of death. It was the moment in which my unbelief was shattered. Christ streamed upon me, Christ in the mystery of the cross." It would take 2 more years of painful groping and wrestling before she coming to grips with what that actually meant for her life. Edith never did anything by half measures. She read both the Old and New Testaments. She continued to study philosophy, looking for every possible truth regarding the state of humanity and the existence of God. Then during the summer of 1921, at the age of 29, Stein was spending the summer with friends and found herself alone one evening. She picked up seemingly by chance the autobiography of St. Teresa of Avila, founder of the Carmelite order. And she was captivated, reading it in one sitting. And as she closed the book, said, "This is the truth." That very day, she bought a missal and a Catholic catechism and soon attended her first Mass. She was baptized the following January, but her thought to immediately enter the Carmelites was delayed for a time. Seeing that her conversion was already a devastating blow to her mother, it was another reason she postponed answering the call to religious life. But as a happy result of the delay, the church would benefit enormously from her contributions as a speaker and writer. As Bishop Barron said, although it was one of her final reasons for entering the church, reading that biography of St. Teresa of Avila, I mean, I've read it, and I don't know what's in it that was so life-changing, but she said, the secret belongs to me. But more what St. John Henry Newman calls the illative sense is the combination of so many factors coming together. She had searched for the truth for 15 years, beginning with her rejection of the faith at age 15. And when she found it, she allowed it to transform her life. So during this time, Edith taught at a Catholic women's school run by the Dominican sisters in a setting that allowed Edith to live like a nun, Bishop Barron said, but I would say a very busy nun then. Because often in the middle of the night was the only time in her packed schedule for sustained prayer. She taught, tutored, trained novices, and returned to her independent intellectual work, publishing essays and giving lectures. It might appear she was moving away from her goal of a contemplative life, yet she was living according to her guiding principle. What did not lay in my plans lay in God's plans. Stein became a leading voice on the Catholic lecture circuit. Her intellectual work became more widely known, and she most often dealt with a topic close to her heart, the role of women in the modern world. Her inability to land a job in the male-dominated academic world of the time, her experience in a single mother home, her own feminism, and her intellectual and spiritual assets all contributed to give her unique insight into this pressing issue. By the time Hitler rose to power in early 1933, Stein was well known in the academic community. Hitler's growing popularity and the increasing pressure on the Jewish people prompted her to request an audience with the Pope in the spring of 1933. She hoped to ask him for a special encyclical which might help counteract the mounting tide of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, her request for a papal audience was not granted, so she sent a letter instead. But it was not until 4 years later that Pope Pius IX issued his German encyclical denouncing Nazism. In April of 1933, as the Nazis had recently passed a law dismissing Jews from government and public positions, Edith was informed she could no longer teach because of her Jewish heritage. And now with her professional opportunities severely restricted, the thought dawned, was it not time at last to enter Carmel? A month earlier, during Holy Week of 1933, Edith stopped at the Carmelite convent in Cologne during the service on Holy Thursday, and the homily moved her very deeply. She wrote, I told her, Lord, that I knew it was his cross that was now being placed upon the Jewish people, that most of them did not understand this, but that those who did would have to take it up willingly in the name of all. I would do that. At the end of the service, I was certain that I had been heard. But what this carrying of the cross was to consist in, that I did not yet know. For her family, entering into the convent was almost a betrayal. They couldn't understand what it meant to her. And it came at the worst possible time, just when the Jewish persecution was intensifying. Her mother was crushed when Edith told her of her decision to enter the convent. Indeed, it was only after her mother's death in 1936 that Edith's sister Rosa felt free to be baptized a Catholic as well. So at age 42, Edith Stein entered the Discalced Carmelite convent in Cologne and would take the name Teresa Benedicta a Cruce. Teresa in honor of St. Teresa of Avila, Benedicta in honor of St. Benedict, a Cruce of the cross, in recognition of her devotion to the cross of Christ. Edith remained in Cologne for 5 years, participating in the life of the community with great joy, and even continuing some of her scholarly work. She completed her postulacy, novitiate, and professed final vows after 5 years in April of 1938. But by November of that year, the nuns of Cologne feared for her safety and sent her secretly to the Carmelite Act in the Netherlands. Her sister Rosa later joined her there as a third-order Carmelite, serving as the convent porter. When Holland fell to the Nazis, Edith and Rosa Stein were in danger again, and plans were made to move them to Switzerland. But before these could be finalized, the Dutch bishops issued an encyclical attacking the anti-Semitic atrocities of the Nazi regime. The Gestapo retaliated immediately by rounding up all Roman Catholic Jews to be sent to the death camps. And so Edith and Rosa were arrested on August 2nd, 1942. When Rosa seemed disoriented as to why they were being led away from the convent, Edith gently encouraged her. Come, Rosa, we go for our people. The sisters were deported to Auschwitz and executed just a week later. Edith Stein was 50 years old. Reports from those who were close to Sister Teresa Benedicta in those final days show her to have been a woman of remarkable inner strength, giving courage to her fellow travelers, comforting and calming them, and helping to feed and bathe the little ones when even their mothers had given up hope and were neglecting them. One woman who survived the war has written a description of Edith as her group was awaiting transportation to the east. Maybe the best way I can explain it is that she carried so much pain that it hurt to see her smile. In my opinion, she was thinking about the suffering that lay ahead, not her own suffering. She was far too resigned for that, but the suffering that was in store for others. Every time I think of her sitting in the barracks, the same picture comes to mind, a Pietà without the Christ. A doctor who met her on the way to her death recalls a conversation he had with her just before she was transferred to Auschwitz, which records some of her final words. The world is made up of opposites, but in the end, nothing remains of these contrasts. What only remains is great love. How is it possible for it to be otherwise? Indeed, in this world, we do experience such opposites, good and evil, joy and suffering, life and death. What only remains is great love. Edith's final words there teach us how to suffer, how to offer ourselves, how to embrace a world so full of violations against the human person. Edith shows how to live as a balm for those wounds in the world, and how such a life lived for Christ will ultimately heal it. Although she did not seek death, Edith had often expressed her willingness to offer herself along with the sacrifice of Christ for the sake of her people, the Jews, and also for the sake of her persecutors. And so on August 7th, 1942, early in the morning, 987 Jews were deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp. And on August 9th, Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, her sister Rosa, and many more of her people were killed in a mass gas chamber at Auschwitz. Pope St. John Paul II beatified her in 1987 and canonized her 11 years later, naming her one of the 6 patron saints of Europe, together with her namesake Saint Benedict, Saint Cyril and Methodius, Saint Bridget of Sweden, and Saint Catherine of Siena. The theme that seems to be universally appreciated throughout Edith Stein's life is her integrity, her appreciation for the truth, Today, we might call it a reality check. When she realized that something was true, she followed it. She allowed it to change her life. Another theme is trust. Stein wrote that when she lectured, I always came down to my one topic, how important it is to learn to live at God's hands. Be determined to seek the truth and learn to live at God's hands. I'll take a break to credit my sources. There are two biographies I used, Edith Stein from Cloister to Concentration Camp, published by Cynthia Kavnar. And I found this book, of course, to be very well researched about her life, but it didn't delve much into her writings. It even barely mentioned the titles of her various dissertations and works. Similarly, the book Edith Stein, a Biography, The Untold Story of a Philosopher and Mystic by Waltraud Herbertstrength, the Carmelite from Germany. I think this one maybe does capture a little bit more of her Carmelite spirituality and mysticism. It also spends a lot of time highlighting her work as a philosopher and the challenges she faced as a woman professional. But to find her writings on the role and dignity of women, I want to now look at the 2008 Endow study. No commercial here. Edith Stein, Seeker of Truth by Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell. As I said, much of Edith Stein's writings on women and women's vocations stem from the decade of her professional life between her Catholic conversion and her entrance into the Carmelite community at Cologne. The importance of these essays comes both in terms of their originality and level of insight, but also in terms of their wider influence, including the late great Pope St. John Paul II. Anyone who has read his encyclical on the dignity and vocation of women or his letter to women can see how he built his theory of the feminine genius upon the foundation developed by Edith Stein. Edith felt a need to educate women, telling them that you can find perfection, not just as a generic human being, but as a woman. Stein rejected the radical feminist claim that there are no important differences between men and women. As a philosopher looking for the basis of true femininity, she begins with what might be called an ontology of woman. After her conversion to Catholicism, Stein intensely studied the great Catholic philosopher and doctor of the church, St. Thomas Aquinas. She was fascinated by St. Thomas's view of the human person as a subsistent unity, both body and soul. Further, since matter is what distinguishes one human being from another, the body is essential to the person, and not simply a machine or a shell for the soul that could be discarded without serious loss to the real self. Now, because we are the only creature on earth to have a rational soul, all people share the traits or abilities of reason along with free choice. But if the soul is the form of the body, and the form of humanity is individuated by being united with this particular body or that particular body, Stein reasoned that the woman's soul will have a spiritual quality distinct from a man's soul. She argued that the differences between men and women profoundly mark their personalities. The woman's body stamps her soul with particular qualities that are common to all women, but different from distinctively masculine traits. Stein saw these differences as complementary and not hierarchical in value, and so they should be recognized and celebrated rather than minimized and deplored. There are two ways of being human, as man or as woman. She considered the differences between males and females to be evident, even to common sense, and so in need of little argument. Her thesis would be denied by many feminists today, but probably not by anyone who has children of both genders or who is taught in a classroom. The differences between girls and boys are evident and seem to resistant to manipulation. Nature has a stubborn way of asserting itself in total disregard for modern gender theories. Like St. John Paul II would do in his later Theology of the Body, Edith Stein looked especially to the creation narratives of Genesis to draw out what she took to be the natural vocation of woman. Every woman, she said, is meant to be both a spouse or companion and a mother. Because of her close connection with human birth and development, woman seeks to cherish, guard, protect, nourish, and advance growth as her natural maternal yearning. Woman naturally focuses on what is human and tends to give relationships a higher importance than work, success, reputation, etc. In other words, women approach moral questions with more attention to how people are affected than to abstract and impersonal considerations such as duty, rights, and justice. A woman is naturally more attuned to the individual, concrete, particular person with all his or her needs and potential. Further, this maternal concern aims at the total development of the other person as a unity of body, soul, and spirit. The maternal aspect of woman's vocation involves helping other persons develop to their fullest potential. And for those who are married, this will include their husbands as well as their children. Motherhood is a universal calling for all women, not just those who are biological mothers. A woman's concern for the good of a person extends to all those whose lives touch hers in some way. St. John Paul II raised this feminine vocation to even greater proportions, looking to women for the rehumanization of the world dominated by hedonism and materialism. In his encyclical, The Gospel of Life, he calls upon women to teach others that human relations are authentic if they are open to accepting the other person. A person who is recognized and loved because of the dignity that comes from being a person and not from other considerations such as usefulness, strength, intelligence, beauty, or health. This contribution of women, declared the Pope, is an indispensable prerequisite for an authentic cultural change, for replacing the culture of death with the civilization of love. In addition to her actual or spiritual motherhood, Edith Stein sees another dimension to a woman's calling, the spousal role of companionship. This involves sharing the life of another, entering into it, and making that person's concerns one's own. One might argue that this is a vocation for both men and women, which is true. But it seems that women have a special genius for friendship, perhaps because of their orientation to the human and personal, and a greater capacity for exercising empathy. Her dissertation on the subject of empathy was completed some years prior to her conversion, but one can see its influence in her later work. She describes empathy as a clear awareness of another person. In empathy, one takes the place of the other without becoming strictly identical to him or her. It is not just understanding the other, but in some sense, taking their experiences on as one's own. Obviously, this ability to enter into another's life is especially helpful within marriage, but it can and should be exercised in other relationships as well. For women who are single or those who have consecrated themselves wholly to God, this aspect of their vocation should take on a more universal scope and will call for a more disinterested, that is to say, more divine kind of love. Everyone who knew Edith Stein tells us that she was a living example of this capacity for empathy. She possessed a tender, even maternal solicitude for others, living that divine, disinterested love. Besides enunciating the innate calling every woman has to be a wife and mother, whether spiritually or physically, Edith Stein was deeply concerned with women's role within society. Should women be confined to the domestic sphere, to home and hearth? Not at all, said Stein. She saw the gains made by the women's movement in the professions and political life, providing equal opportunities to women in these areas to be a positive thing. However, for Edith, when a woman enters into the broader culture and workplace outside of her family, she does so to transform it by her unique approach to the human person. Women are more capable than men of paying attention to another person. They have a sensitivity to each person, especially at a time when the value and dignity of the person is being degraded. Therefore, Edith Stein taught that the feminine attitude, with its perceptive and loving focus on the personal and the whole, is a necessary attitude for the development of humanity. To summarize, Stein believed that a woman works in a job which, even when it's one traditionally that's been held by a man, she has a choice. to either feel forced into conditions of life and work alien to her nature, that is by trying to act like a man, or if she is strong enough, she can transform that job environment into one which shares her feminine ethos of paying attention to the human person and fostering its development. When asked whether the natural vocation of women ruled out certain professions as unsuitable for her, Stein answered there is no profession which cannot be practiced by a woman. Now, some professions will continue to attract more women than men because of their strong human component. Thus, we might expect to find a larger percentage of women drawn to fields like teaching, nursing, social work, psychology, etc. But she believed every profession can be practiced in a feminine way. That is, every profession can be humanized, made more person-friendly, and brought into greater contact with human concerns. So it is a good thing for society that women should be found in every profession. Speaking on the role of women in national life, Stein urged, the nation doesn't simply need what we have, it needs what we are. The same could be said about the factory, the office, the university, the political sphere, the school, the home. They all need the presence of women. Stein especially encouraged women to become involved in political life. The maternal concern of women, she felt, should lead to a deep interest in the life of the community, from the PTA all the way to the presidency. Since the decisions made in the public square have a deep impact on the family and how persons generally, how human persons are treated, women automatically have a big stake in them. In dark times, as in her generation, but also our own, women are especially called to speak out with courage and to make an impact beyond their own families and communities. For Stein, it is unlikely that this participation in public life will consist in seizing of power. Rather, she seems to have in mind the public witness that women might offer. Stein encouraged every woman to seek to live out in her own life and circumstances the ideal of true womanhood. This means especially exercising that maternal vocation, which is given primarily to women, which holds little in the way of glamour or attraction for many today. The work of a mother is hidden for the most part, and even its rewards are often intangible. This is exactly why Edith Stein looked to women to preserve within our society these spiritual values that cannot be measured. Today, more than ever, we need that witness to a spiritual and transcendent commandment of love. And thus, Edith Stein continues to urge Catholic women to fight for these very truths by living them. But you do not fight alone. The Catholic woman stands with Mary and with the Church under the cross. Therefore, maybe because this talk became a little more of a lecture and not quite as spiritual as I wanted, I want to end with a longer quote from Edith Stein on how the truly liberated woman lives a Eucharistic life, a prayerful life, a Marian life. To have divine love as its inner form, a woman's life must be a Eucharistic life. Only in daily, confidential relationship with the Lord in the tabernacle can one forget self, become free of all one's own wishes and pretensions, and have a heart open to all the needs and wants of others. Whoever seeks to consult with the Eucharistic God in all her concerns, whoever lets herself be purified by her sanctifying power, coming from the sacrifice at the altar, offering yourself to the Lord in this sacrifice. Whoever receives the Lord in her soul's innermost depth in Holy Communion cannot but be drawn ever more deeply and powerfully into the flow of divine life, incorporated into the mystical body of Christ, her heart converted to the likeness of the divine heart. Something else is closely related to this. When we entrust all the troubles of our early existence confidently to the divine heart, we are relieved of them. Then our soul is free to participate in the divine life. Therefore, the life of an authentic Catholic woman is also a liturgical life. Whoever prays together with the Church in spirit and in truth knows that her whole life must be formed by this life of prayer. Whether she is a mother in the home or occupies a place in the limelight of public life, she lives behind quiet cloister walls. She must be a handmaid of the Lord everywhere. So had the Mother of God in all circumstances of her life, as the temple virgin enclosed in that hallowed precinct, by her quiet work in Bethlehem and Nazareth, as guide to the apostles and the Christian community after the death of her son. Were each woman an image of the Mother of God, a spouse of Christ, an apostle of the divine heart, then would each fulfill her feminine vocation, no matter what conditions she lived and what worldly activity absorbed her life. Saint Teresa, Benedicta of the Cross, pray for us.
Person put that last slide back up.
The
The one about the reference.
The reference, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
that wasn't on the bibliography, I guess. So the first question I always get is, when is Edith Stein going to be named a doctor of the church? And I hate to discourage you, but there's never been a doctor of the church that was a martyr, because the witness of their life and giving their life as a martyr is greater than the witness of their writings and teachings. So I'm not saying it can't be done, but the church's tradition that it's the witness of her death that speaks even more